Welcome to An Interview in History. Imagine a podcast that serves as a bridge across time, connecting listeners to the voices of history's most impactful figures. Each episode is a deep dive into the lives and legacies of these individuals, exploring not just their well-documented achievements, but also uncovering lesser-known facts that shaped their contributions to our world. From scientists who unlocked the mysteries of the universe to activists who fought for social change, each story is a testament to the indelible mark they left on society. This journey through history will not only educate, but also inspire listeners to appreciate the intricate tapestry of human progress. Hi, my name is Steve Bury, the host of An Interview in History. This week, we're talking with Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, who was a British statesman, military officer, and writer who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945 during the Second World War, and again from 1951 to 1955. Sir Winston, thank you for joining us today. Let's begin with your early years. Could you tell us about your family and childhood?
It is a pleasure to speak with you. I was born on November 30, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, a grand but, I must confess, rather cold setting for a childhood. My father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant but tempestuous politician, while my mother, Jeannie Jerome, was a vivacious American socialite. My relationship with my parents was somewhat distant. My father was often preoccupied with his political ambitions, and my mother, while charming and influential, was consumed with London society. As a child, I was sent off to boarding schools where I was not what you might call a model student. My academic performance was lackluster except in subjects I enjoyed, such as history and English. Harrow School was where I began to distinguish myself, particularly in debating and writing. I later attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where I excelled.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I had a younger brother, Jack, who was far more genial and easygoing than I. We shared a cordial relationship, though we led very different lives. Jack's life was quieter and less tumultuous, but we always supported one another.
Weren't you and your brother Jack raised primarily by a nanny?
Yes. For much of the 1880s, my father and mother were effectively estranged, and my brother and I were cared for by our nanny, Elizabeth Everest. When she died in 1895, I remember saying that she had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived.
Let's move on to your military career. What drew you to the Army?
The military offered a young man like myself adventure and purpose. I served in India, Sudan, and South Africa, where I gained invaluable experience and, perhaps more importantly, material for my writing. My escape from a Boer prison camp during the Second Boer War was a defining moment for me. It cemented my reputation as daring and resourceful young officer.
You were also involved in politics at a young age. How did that transition happen?
My father's career greatly influenced me. Though he passed away when I was just 21, I determined to continue his legacy. After leaving the army, I entered Parliament in 1900 as a Conservative, but soon crossed the floor to join the Liberals. I was ambitious, driven by a desire to enact reforms.
Your role in World War I was controversial. What are your thoughts on that period?
The Great War. As First Lord of the Admiralty, I was a fervent advocate for naval preparedness. However, the Gallipoli campaign, which I championed, was a bitter failure. The loss of life still haunts me. Though I resigned my post, I later returned to serve as a battalion commander on the Western Front, a humbling and enlightening experience.
And then came World War II, where your leadership became iconic. How did you approach such a monumental challenge?
By the time the Second World War erupted, I had long warned of the dangers posed by Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. As Prime Minister, my task was to rally the nation. My speeches, often written late into the night with a glass of brandy, aimed to inspire courage and unity. Working closely with allies like Franklin Roosevelt was essential. Together we forged the Atlantic Charter, laying the groundwork for post-war peace.
Speaking of Roosevelt, what was your relationship like with him and later with Eisenhower?
Roosevelt was a remarkable man. We shared a deep respect and affection, though we did not always see eye to eye. He had a calm, reassuring presence which complemented my fiery determination. As for Eisenhower, I held him in high regard as a soldier and later as president. His leadership during the D-Day invasion was exemplary.
Let's talk a little more about your relationship with Roosevelt. Was it smooth, or were there times when you didn't get along?
Franklin Roosevelt, one of the most significant figures in my life during the war. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and a shared vision for the defeat of Nazi Germany. But it was not without its challenges. At the outset, I had to work hard to bring the United States into the war. Roosevelt was sympathetic to our cause, but he had political constraints. He could not simply declare war. America had strong isolationist sentiments at the time, so I did everything I could to persuade him that Britain would fight on no matter what, and that our fates were intertwined. Once the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor, our collaboration became more structured. We exchanged countless letters and messages, over 1,700 communications in total. We also met several times in person, most notably at the Atlantic Conference in 1941, where we laid out the principles of the post-war world in what became the Atlantic Charter. However, there were certainly moments of disagreement. Roosevelt had a way of keeping people guessing, including me. He could be charming one moment and elusive the next. One of our greatest points of contention was the timing of the Second Front, the invasion of France. I urged for a Mediterranean strategy first, striking at the soft underbelly of Europe through Italy and North Africa, while Roosevelt and his generals, particularly Eisenhower, pressed for an earlier invasion of France. Then, of course, there was the issue of Britain's empire. Roosevelt was no great admirer of colonial rule, and he made it clear that he wanted to see the British Empire dismantled after the war. That was a bitter pill for me to swallow. I believed Britain's role in the world was one of stability and leadership, while Roosevelt saw colonialism as an outdated concept that needed to end. Yet, despite our differences, I considered him a great friend. His leadership was indispensable to our victory, and I was deeply saddened by his passing in April of 1945. We may not have agreed on everything, but together we ensured that tyranny was defeated.
Mr. Churchill, I have heard that you knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor before it happened, because your intelligence team were able to decipher some text. How do you respond to that?
I must categorically refute such an assertion. It is a grave misunderstanding of the facts. At no point before December 7, 1941, did I or my government have prior knowledge of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. While British and American intelligence were indeed intercepting and attempting to decode Japanese communications, the extent of our ability to decipher them was limited at the time. Crucially, the most sensitive Japanese diplomatic and military messages, particularly those related to the Pearl Harbor attack, were not fully deciphered until after the event had already transpired. Furthermore, let me state unequivocally that had I possessed foreknowledge of such an attack, I would have immediately shared it with President Roosevelt. The relationship between Britain and the United States was one of deepening alliance, and it would have been in neither of our interests to withhold such a crucial warning. It was Japan's own actions that drew America into the war, and it is well documented that American military leadership was taken by surprise on that fateful day. Any suggestion that I knew beforehand and remained silent is not only incorrect, but an insult to the profound sacrifice of those who lost their lives in the attack. Thank you. Now, Mr. Churchill, World War II impacted the whole world. What do you see as the greatest impact on England? The Second World War was a trial by fire for Britain. We stood alone in 1940, facing the full might of Nazi Germany. The Blitz rained destruction upon our cities. Our economy was stretched to its limits, and nearly every family bore the weight of loss. Yet we endured. The war tested our resilience and, in doing so, changed Britain forever. If I were to identify the greatest impact, I would say it was twofold: the transformation of our global position and the rise of the welfare state at home. Before the war, Britain was a preeminent global power, with an empire spanning the world. By the war's end, however, we were deeply in debt and reliant on American support. The war accelerated the decline of the British Empire. Colonies that had once looked to London for leadership began seeking independence. India, our crown jewel, gained its independence in 1947, a development I deeply regretted, but recognized as inevitable. At home, the war reshaped society. The shared sacrifices of the British people, rich and poor, men and women, created a demand for a more just and equitable society. The Beveridge Report, during the war, laid the foundation for the welfare state. Though I was not its architect, the Labour government that followed my wartime leadership implemented sweeping reforms. The National Health Service expanded Social Security and greater support for the working class. Britain emerged victorious, but the war changed us. We were no longer the empire we had been, yet we remained a nation of courage, ingenuity, and perseverance. That, above all, is what I hope endures. I once said to the House that I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. That was quite a speech. What about your interactions with the royal family? My respect for the monarchy is profound. I had the privilege of serving Queen Elizabeth II during her early reign. Her steadfastness and dignity are qualities I deeply admire. I also worked closely with her father, King George VI, during the war. He was a pillar of strength during Britain's darkest hours. Now in your later years, how do you reflect on your life and legacy? I have devoted my final years to writing, particularly my 6-volume history of the Second World War. Winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953 was a cherished honor. I also spend time painting, which provides solace. As for my legacy, I hope history remembers me not just for my successes, but also for my perseverance through failure. Finally, what advice would you give to future generations? Never, never, never give in. Whether facing personal trials or great global challenges, persistence is the key to triumph. And of course, always keep your sense of humor. Thank you, Sir Winston, for sharing your incredible journey with us. It has been my pleasure. Good day to you. Churchill suffered a stroke on the 10th of January, 1965, and died on the 24th of January. Like the Duke of Wellington in 1852 and William Gladstone in 1898, Churchill was given a state funeral. His coffin lay in state at Westminster Hall for 3 days. The funeral ceremony was at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 30th of January. Afterwards, the coffin was taken by boat along the River Thames to Waterloo Station and from there by a special train to the family plot at St. Martin's Church in Baldon. Worldwide, numerous memorials have been dedicated to Churchill. His statue in Parliament Square was unveiled by his widow Clementine in 1973 and is one of only 12 in the square. Churchill was the first of only 8 people to be granted honorary citizenship of the United States. The United States Navy honored him in 1999 by naming the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer as the USS Winston S. Churchill. Other memorials in North America include the National Churchill Museum in Fulton, where he made the 1946 Iron Curtain speech, Churchill Square in Edmonton, Alberta, and the Winston Churchill Range, a mountain range northwest of Lake Louise, also in Alberta, which was renamed after Churchill in 1956. And now, another forgotten history. In 1910, a woman in a petticoat was captured riding an ostrich, showcasing the quirky and often daring activities that were popular in certain circles during the early 20th century. While ostrich riding might seem unusual today, it was a popular novelty in some parts of the world, particularly in places like South Africa, where ostriches were abundant. The image of a woman confidently perched on an ostrich reflects both the fascination with the exotic animals during that time and the growing trend of women breaking boundaries in terms of fashion and activities. The petticoat, a garment that symbolizes more traditional, modest fashion of the period, juxtaposes the audacity of the act, making this image a remarkable snapshot of its era. The idea of women participating in such unusual activities also ties into the broader social movements happening at the time. The earliest 20th century saw women beginning to embrace more independent roles, moving beyond the domestic sphere and into public life. This period marked the rise of the suffrage movement as women fought for the right to vote and challenge societal expectations. In this sense, the image of a woman riding on an ostrich can be seen as a playful but significant expression of women's increasing agency and willingness to engage in adventures
previously dominated by men or considered out of the ordinary for their gender. A woman with its whimsical nature captures a fleeting moment in time when novelty, fashion, and the breaking of social norms converged. The woman's boldness in riding the ostrich in a petticoat encapsulates the spirits of a time when new ideas were emerging and societal constraints were being challenged. It's a reminder of the fun and playful side of history, where even something as simple as a woman riding on an ostrich could leave a lasting impression. Join us next week when we talk with the famous inventor Thomas Alva Edison. Until then, take care